In 1943, while Nazi soldiers patrolled every corner of occupied Italy, a man pedaled past their checkpoints carrying enough evidence to have him executed on the spot. Hidden inside the hollow steel tubes of his bicycle frame were dozens of forged identity documents, each one a lifeline for Jewish families marked for deportation to Auschwitz. The soldiers waved him through every single time. They had no idea they were looking at one of the most decorated athletes in Italian history, a national cycling champion whose legs had carried him to victory on racetracks across Europe. But now, those same legs were carrying something far more valuable than trophies. His name was Gino Bartali, and the story of what he did during World War II remained buried for over 60 years, hidden even from his own children. This is the untold account of the man they would later call the Cyclist of God, and by the end of this video, you will understand why the world forgot the greatest race he ever rode. Italy in the early 1940s was a nation caught between admiration and horror. Mussolini had aligned the country with Hitler, and by 1943, German forces occupied the northern regions with brutal efficiency. In cities like Florence, where Bartali lived, the streets that once hummed with the laughter of cafe culture now echoed with the sharp boots of SS patrols. Jewish families who had lived in Italy for generations suddenly found themselves stripped of rights, businesses, and eventually their freedom. The racial laws came first, barring Jews from schools and professions. Then came the deportations. Trains began leaving Italian stations bound for camps in Poland, packed with men, women, and children who would never return. The world Bartali had known, the world of competitive cycling and roaring crowds, had collapsed into something unrecognizable. But while many Italians looked away, paralyzed by fear or complicity, Bartali made a choice that would define the rest of his life. Before the war, Gino Bartali was not just famous, he was a legend. He had won the Giro d'Italia twice and claimed victory in the Tour de France in 1938, becoming a national hero at a time when Italy desperately needed one. His rivalry with fellow cyclist Fausto Coppi captivated the entire country, splitting fans into passionate camps. Bartali was known for his deeply Catholic faith, often seen praying before races or visiting churches during rest days. He was a man of routine, discipline, and quiet humility, the kind of champion who let his legs do the talking. When the war began, he could have stayed safe, protected by his fame and his status as a symbol of Italian strength. The fascist regime loved athletes like him, men who embodied the physical ideals of the new Italy. But Bartali saw what was happening to his Jewish neighbors, and his faith would not allow him to be a bystander. In 1943, a Catholic network in Florence approached him with a request that seemed insane. They needed someone to transport forged identity documents and photographs between cities, someone who could move freely without raising suspicion. The documents were lifelines, false papers that allowed Jewish families to assume new identities, to disappear into the countryside or flee across borders, but transporting them was a death sentence if caught. The Gestapo had eyes everywhere, and anyone found aiding Jews faced immediate execution. Bartali listened to the proposal and did not hesitate. He told them he would do it, but on one condition: no one could ever know. Not the press, not the government, not even his own family. What he was about to do could never be used for glory or recognition. It had to remain a secret, because the moment it became public, the people he was saving would be in danger. And so, Gino Bartali began the most dangerous training rides of his life. He would wake before dawn, load his bicycle with hidden documents tucked inside the frame tubes, and pedal hundreds of kilometers across occupied Italy. To anyone watching, he was simply a champion, maintaining his conditioning, a familiar sight on the roads. But inside that bicycle, rolled tightly in waterproof paper, were identity cards, baptismal certificates, and photographs that could mean the difference between life and death. He rode through checkpoints where German soldiers stopped travelers at gunpoint, searched bags, and demanded papers, and every single time they let him pass. Some recognized him and asked for autographs. Others simply waved the famous cyclist through, never imagining that a national hero could be part of the resistance. Bartali played his role perfectly, always calm, always respectful, his face showing nothing but the quiet determination of an athlete in training. But the risks were escalating with every ride, and Bartali knew that his luck could not last forever. The Gestapo was tightening its grip on Florence, and whispers of a resistance network were beginning to surface. Informants were everywhere, and one mistake, one suspicious glance, one search that went deeper than usual would expose everything. The documents he carried represented entire families, and if he was caught, it would not just be his life on the line. It would be the lives of everyone in the network, and the lives of every Jewish family waiting for the papers that would set them free. Gino Bartali pedaled faster, pushing his body to the limit, racing not against other cyclists but against time itself. The turning point came in September of 1943, when everything Bartali had feared became reality. The Italian government, which had been a reluctant partner in Hitler's war, suddenly collapsed. Mussolini was overthrown, and for a brief moment it seemed like the nightmare might end. But that hope died within days. German forces poured into northern Italy, no longer as allies but as occupiers, and they brought with them a brutality that made the previous years look merciful. The SS began systematic raids on Jewish neighborhoods, kicking down doors in the middle of the night, dragging entire families into trucks bound for transit camps. In Florence, the Jewish population that had lived in relative hiding now faced imminent deportation. The forged documents that Bartali had been transporting were no longer just a precaution. They were the only thing standing between hundreds of people and the gas chambers of Auschwitz. The Catholic network that had recruited Bartali operated out of a modest convent in the hills outside Florence, led by a group of nuns and a handful of priests who had turned their religious sanctuary into a forgery workshop. They worked in secret, hunched over desks by candlelight, carefully crafting identity cards that could pass inspection at checkpoints. Each document required precision. The right stamps, the right signatures, the right photographs mounted with the correct glue. A single error could mean death, not just for the person carrying the paper, but for everyone involved in its creation. The demand for these documents exploded after the German occupation, and the network was struggling to keep up. They needed someone who could move faster, cover more ground, and do it without drawing attention. Bartali was their answer, and he knew it. He began riding longer routes, sometimes covering 300 kilometers in a single day, his legs burning with exhaustion as he pushed through mountain passes and back roads to avoid the main highways where German patrols were heaviest. But the Gestapo was not blind, and whispers of a resistance operation in Florence had reached their ears. They began setting up random checkpoints, stopping cyclists and pedestrians without warning, tearing apart luggage and searching clothing for anything suspicious. Bartali had close calls, moments where a German officer held his bicycle a little too long, ran his hands along the frame a little too carefully. On one ride, a young SS soldier asked him to dismount and began inspecting the bike, his fingers tracing the welds and joints. Bartali stood there, his heart hammering in his chest, his face locked in the calm expression of a man who had nothing to hide. The soldier looked up at him, recognized the face of Italy's cycling champion, and smiled. He asked for an autograph, handed the bike back and waved him through. Bartali signed the paper, climbed back on his bicycle, and pedaled away, knowing that luck like that could not hold forever. The network began to expand its operations, and Bartali found himself transporting more than just documents. He carried messages between resistance cells, photographs of German troop movements, and even stolen Nazi correspondence that detailed deportation schedules. His bicycle became a mobile intelligence hub, and his reputation as a training-obsessed athlete became the perfect cover. He rode through rain, through snow, through the oppressive summer heat, always maintaining the image of a champion who refused to let the war interrupt his conditioning. But the truth was, Bartali was no longer training for races. He was training for survival, for the endurance required to keep riding when every muscle screamed for rest, when fear made his hands shake on the handlebars, when the weight of the lives hidden in his frame threatened to crush him. And then, in the autumn of 1943, the Gestapo made their move. They raided the convent where the forged documents were being produced, arresting 3 nuns and a priest who had been working with the resistance. Under interrogation, the network feared someone might break, might reveal the name of the cyclist who had been transporting the papers. Bartali received a warning from a contact in the network. Lie low, stop riding, disappear until the heat passed. But Bartali looked at the stack of documents waiting to be delivered. Documents that represented families hiding in barns and cellars, waiting for the papers that would let them escape. And he made a decision. He loaded his bicycle one more time, kissed his wife goodbye without telling her where he was going, and pedaled out into the occupied streets of Florence, knowing that this ride might be his last. The roads outside Florence had become a gauntlet of fear and uncertainty. Every kilometer Bartali pedaled brought him closer to another checkpoint, another inspection, another moment where a single wrong move could unravel everything. The documents hidden in his bicycle frame that autumn day included identity papers for a family of 5 hiding in a farmhouse near Assisi, baptismal certificates for 2 children whose real names had been erased from official records, and photographs that would allow 3 elderly Jews to pass as Catholic refugees fleeing the fighting in the south. Bartali had memorized every detail of the route, every back road and forest path that might help him avoid the main highways where German patrols were thickest, but avoiding the patrols entirely was impossible. The Nazis had flooded the region with soldiers, and their checkpoints appeared without warning, sometimes just temporary barricades thrown across a country road with armed guards demanding papers from everyone who passed. What made Bartali's mission even more dangerous was the new directive that had come down from Berlin. Hitler's regime, furious at Italy's betrayal and collapse, had ordered the complete and immediate deportation of all Jews in occupied Italian territory. The orders were clear and brutal. No exceptions, no delays, no mercy. SS units began conducting house-to-house searches in every major city, checking identity documents against registries, comparing faces to photographs in files compiled by Mussolini's racial laws. The forged papers Bartali carried were no longer just a way to help people hide. They were the only way to help people survive. Without them, entire families would be loaded onto trains within days, transported to camps where their fate was already sealed. Bartali understood the weight of what he carried, and it terrified him. But his faith told him that fear was not a reason to stop. It was a reason to pedal harder. On that particular ride, Bartali encountered a checkpoint he had never seen before, a hastily erected barrier near a small village called Tarantola, manned by 4 German soldiers who looked young, nervous, and eager to prove themselves. They stopped him immediately, ordered him off the bicycle, and began asking questions in broken Italian. Where was he going? Why was he riding so far from Florence? What was he carrying? Bartali answered calmly, explaining that he was a professional cyclist, that training was his life, that even during the war he needed to maintain his conditioning for when racing resumed. One of the soldiers recognized his name and seemed excited, but another, an officer with cold eyes and a methodical demeanor, was not impressed by fame. He picked up the bicycle, hefted it in his hands as if testing its weight, and ran his fingers along the frame. Bartali watched, his breath shallow, his mind racing through possible explanations if the officer decided to disassemble the bike. The officer set the bicycle down and looked Bartali directly in the eyes, studying him for what felt like an eternity. Then he asked a question that made Bartali's blood turn to ice. Why did the bicycle feel heavier than it should? Bartali forced himself to smile, to stay calm, and he explained that it was a custom racing frame built with reinforced steel tubes to handle the rough mountain roads he trained on. The officer seemed unconvinced, and he gestured to one of the younger soldiers to bring tools from their vehicle. Bartali's mind went into overdrive. If they opened the frame, if they found the documents, it would not just be his execution. It would be the end of the entire network. The families waiting for those papers would be discovered. The nuns and priests still operating in Florence would be arrested. Everything would collapse because of this one checkpoint, this one suspicious officer, this one moment of bad luck. But then, something unexpected happened. An older German soldier, a sergeant who had been smoking a cigarette and watching the scene with bored detachment, walked over and said something in German to the officer. Bartali did not understand the words, but he understood the tone. Irritation, impatience, the voice of a man who wanted to move on. The officer hesitated, looked at Bartali one more time, and then waved him through with a dismissive flick of his hand. Bartali climbed back onto his bicycle, forced his shaking legs to pedal smoothly, and rode away at a steady pace, resisting every instinct to sprint. He did not look back. He did not breathe fully until he was a kilometer down the road, and even then, the terror stayed with him, a cold weight in his chest that reminded him how close he had come to disaster. But he kept riding, because the documents in his frame were still waiting to be delivered, and people were still waiting to be saved. By the winter of 1943, Bartali had become a ghost on the roads of occupied Italy, a silent operator whose routes covered hundreds of kilometers each week. The network had given him a new role, one that went beyond simple document transport. He was now a courier for the entire resistance operation in Tuscany, carrying not just forged papers, but coded messages, intelligence reports, and coordinates for safe houses where Jewish families could hide while waiting for their escape routes to open. His bicycle became a mobile lifeline, connecting isolated cells of resistance fighters who could not risk meeting in person or communicating through channels the Gestapo might intercept. Bartali rode in all weather, through freezing rain that turned mountain roads into rivers of mud, through snow that made his tires slip and his hands go numb on the handlebars. He rode when his body screamed for rest, when illness left him feverish and weak, when the rational part of his mind told him that continuing was suicide. The physical toll was immense, but the psychological weight was even heavier. Every ride meant carrying the knowledge that a single mistake would result in mass arrests and executions. Bartali began having nightmares, visions of being stopped at a checkpoint and watching soldiers pull the hidden documents from his bicycle frame, unrolling them one by one, reading the names of families he had promised to save. He would wake in the middle of the night drenched in sweat, his wife asking what was wrong, and he would lie to her, telling her it was just stress from the war, just worry about when racing might resume. He could not tell her the truth. The network had made that rule absolute. No family members could know, because if the Gestapo came for him, they would interrogate everyone he loved, and ignorance was the only protection he could give them. The complexity of the operation grew as the months passed. The Catholic network expanded beyond Florence, establishing connections with monasteries and convents across central Italy, each one functioning as a station in an underground railroad that moved Jewish refugees toward neutral Switzerland or Allied-controlled territory in the south. Bartali's role evolved accordingly. He began carrying detailed maps hidden inside fake water bottles, instructions for crossing the Swiss border concealed in the padding of his saddle, and even small amounts of money sewn into the lining of his cycling jersey. The network trusted him completely, and that trust came with crushing responsibility. On one ride, he transported the only copy of a master list containing the locations of 40 Jewish families hiding in the countryside around Assisi. If that list had been discovered, it would have led the Nazis directly to every single family. Bartali rode with it pressed against his skin, wrapped in waterproof cloth, and he did not stop pedaling until it was safely delivered to a priest in Perugia who would use it to coordinate the next phase of evacuations. But the Gestapo was closing in, and Bartali knew it. Informants had begun appearing in Florence, locals who collaborated with the Germans in exchange for money or protection, or simply out of fear. The network lost 2 operatives in a single week, both arrested after being betrayed by someone they had trusted. The arrests sent shockwaves through the resistance, and everyone involved began looking over their shoulders, wondering who might be next. Bartali received multiple warnings to stop riding, to go into hiding until the danger passed, but he refused. He had made a promise to the families whose lives depended on his deliveries, and his Catholic faith taught him that a promise made before God was unbreakable. So he adapted instead of stopping. He changed his routes constantly, never riding the same road twice in a row. He varied his departure times, sometimes leaving at dawn, sometimes in the middle of the night. He started carrying a small pistol hidden in his saddlebag, knowing he would never use it, but needing to feel like he had some defense if the worst happened. The winter of 1943 turned into the spring of 1944, and the war showed no signs of ending. Allied forces were advancing slowly up the Italian peninsula, but progress was measured in meters, not kilometers, and German resistance was ferocious. In Florence, the occupation tightened. Curfews became stricter, checkpoints multiplied, and the Gestapo began conducting random raids on homes and businesses, searching for evidence of resistance activity. Bartali watched his city transform into a prison, its streets patrolled by soldiers who shot civilians for breaking curfew or failing to show proper deference to their occupiers. And through it all he kept riding, his legs pushing the pedals in an endless rhythm, his mind focused on the only thing that mattered, getting the documents to the people who needed them, one ride at a time, one life at a time, until either the war ended or his luck finally ran out. In June of 1944, the situation in Florence reached a breaking point. Allied bombers had begun targeting German supply lines and military installations throughout Tuscany, and the city found itself caught in the crossfire between advancing American forces and a retreating but still deadly Wehrmacht. The Nazis, sensing their grip on Italy slipping away, became even more vicious in their final months of occupation. Mass executions became common, with civilians shot in public squares as warnings against resistance activity. The deportation of Jews accelerated to a frantic pace, with the SS determined to empty every transit camp and complete their grim mission before Allied troops arrived. For Bartali and the network, this meant that the demand for forged documents reached unprecedented levels, and the risk of discovery grew exponentially with every passing day. Bartali's most dangerous mission came during this chaotic period, a ride that would push him to the absolute edge of his physical and mental limits. The network had received desperate word from a Jewish community hiding in a series of farmhouses near the town of Lucca, about 80 kilometers west of Florence. 53 people, including 17 children, were sheltering there, but their location had been compromised. A local fascist official had become suspicious of the unusual activity around the farms and had begun asking questions. The community needed identity documents immediately, within 48 hours, or they would have to scatter into the countryside with no papers and no plan, which meant certain capture. The network's forgers worked through the night, producing 53 complete identity packages, each one containing a card, a photograph, and supporting documentation. But getting them to Lucca meant crossing some of the most heavily patrolled territory in Tuscany, including several major checkpoints on the main road that Bartali had been avoiding for weeks. He left Florence at 3 in the morning, riding under a moonless sky with the documents distributed throughout his bicycle frame, his clothing, and even tucked inside the hollow handlebars. The weight was noticeable, and Bartali knew that any thorough inspection would reveal the papers instantly. His plan was to avoid the main highway entirely, taking a network of farm roads and forest paths that would add 30 kilometers to the journey, but keep him away from the largest checkpoints. For the first 2 hours, the plan worked perfectly. He encountered no patrols, saw no soldiers, moved through the darkness like a shadow. But as dawn broke and he approached the outskirts of Lucca, his luck changed. A German convoy appeared on the road ahead, 3 trucks filled with soldiers heading in the opposite direction. Bartali had no choice but to keep riding toward them, maintaining the steady pace of a morning training ride, his face showing nothing but calm determination. The convoy passed him without stopping, but one of the trucks slowed down and a soldier leaned out to look at him. Bartali kept his eyes forward, his legs pumping at a measured cadence, every fiber of his being screaming at him to sprint away. The truck accelerated and continued down the road, and Bartali allowed himself a single deep breath before continuing. But 5 kilometers later, he encountered something far worse. A full checkpoint had been established at a crossroads, complete with a wooden barrier, multiple armed guards, and a table where officers were meticulously examining every traveler's papers. There was no way around it. The side roads were blocked, the fields too muddy to ride through. Bartali would have to go straight through the checkpoint, carrying 53 sets of forged documents, and hope that his fame and his calm demeanor would be enough to save him one more time. He approached the barrier slowly, preparing his explanation, rehearsing the words in his mind. But as he drew closer, he noticed something unusual. The soldiers at the checkpoint were not the typical SS or Gestapo personnel he had encountered before. They were Wehrmacht, regular German army troops, and they looked exhausted, disorganized, and far more interested in eating their breakfast than interrogating cyclists. Bartali stopped at the barrier, and a young soldier waved him over without much interest. The soldier asked for his identity card, glanced at it, looked up at Bartali's face, and then did a double take. He recognized the name, recognized the face, and suddenly the tired soldier transformed into an excited fan. He called over his companions, showed them Bartali's card, and within moments the entire checkpoint was buzzing with excitement. They asked him about the Tour de France, about his rivalry with Coppi, about when racing would return after the war. Bartali answered their questions patiently, signed autographs on scraps of paper, and even posed for a photograph with 3 of the soldiers. And then, without ever asking what he was carrying or where he was going, they raised the barrier and waved him through, still talking excitedly among themselves about meeting a cycling legend. Bartali rode away, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst, carrying the weight of 53 lives toward safety. Bartali delivered the 53 identity packages to the Jewish families near Lucca by mid-morning, handing them over to a priest who had been coordinating the evacuation. The relief on the priest's face was visible, his hands trembling as he accepted the documents that would allow an entire community to vanish into new identities before the fascist official could act. Bartali did not stay to witness the distribution or to receive thanks. He never did. The network had trained him to operate like a ghost, deliver, confirm receipt, and disappear immediately. Every minute spent in one place increased the risk of being followed or remembered by the wrong person. So he climbed back onto his bicycle, his legs already aching from the 80-kilometer ride, and began the return journey to Florence. But the trip back would prove even more treacherous than the morning ride, because the city he was returning to was beginning to collapse. By the time Bartali reached the outskirts of Florence that evening, smoke was rising from multiple locations across the city. Allied bombing raids had intensified, targeting bridges and rail yards that the Germans were using to move troops and supplies. The Nazis, in a final act of spite, had begun destroying parts of the city themselves, blowing up historical buildings and infrastructure to deny their use to the advancing Allies. The famous Ponte Vecchio, the medieval bridge that had stood for centuries, was one of the few structures they spared, but everything around it was rubble. Bartali rode through streets he no longer recognized, past buildings reduced to skeletal frames, past craters where bombs had torn through cobblestones. The civilian population was in chaos, thousands fleeing toward the countryside to escape the fighting, others hiding in basements and churches, praying that the liberation would come before the final destruction. The Catholic network that had sustained Bartali's missions was fracturing under the pressure. Several key members had been arrested in a Gestapo sweep, and the convent outside Florence where the documents had been forged was now abandoned, the nuns scattered to safer locations. Communication between resistance cells became nearly impossible as German soldiers patrolled constantly, shooting anyone who violated curfew or appeared suspicious. Bartali received word that he should cease all operations immediately, that the risk had become too great, that preserving what remained of the network was more important than attempting any more rescues. But even as the message reached him, he learned of one final group that desperately needed help. A family of 7 hiding in the basement of a destroyed synagogue in the heart of Florence, with no papers and no way out as German patrols intensified their searches of abandoned buildings. Bartali knew that attempting a rescue in the middle of Florence, with the city under siege and patrols everywhere, was borderline suicidal. But he also knew that if he did not act, the family would be discovered within days and deported on one of the last trains leaving for Auschwitz. His faith would not allow him to abandon them, and his conscience would not allow him to hide behind the excuse of following orders. So he made a decision that defied all logic and training. He would go into the city center on foot, carrying forged documents hidden on his person, and attempt to reach the family before the Gestapo did. He could not use his bicycle for this mission because the streets were too damaged and too heavily monitored. This would be a slow, dangerous walk through a war zone, relying entirely on timing, nerve, and the hope that God would protect him one more time. He left his home after midnight, kissing his wife goodbye with the lie that he was going to check on a friend's family, and he walked into the burning city, carrying 7 sets of identity documents sewn into the lining of his coat. The streets were lit by fires from bombed buildings, and the sound of distant artillery rumbled like thunder. Bartali moved through shadows, avoiding main roads, cutting through alleyways and bombed-out buildings, his ears alert for the sound of German patrols. Twice he had to hide as soldiers passed within meters of his position, and once he had to run when a patrol spotted him and shouted for him to halt. He did not stop. He kept moving, his legs carrying him through the ruins of his beloved Florence, toward a basement where 7 people waited in darkness, their fate depending entirely on whether a cyclist who had spent his life racing toward finish lines could complete one final desperate sprint toward salvation. Bartali reached the ruins of the synagogue just before dawn, his clothes soaked with sweat despite the cool night air, his heart hammering from the adrenaline of evading patrols. The building had been bombed weeks earlier, its once beautiful facade reduced to a pile of broken stone and shattered glass. He found the entrance to the basement, hidden beneath a collapsed section of wall, exactly where his contact had described it. He knocked 3 times, paused, then knocked twice more, the signal that identified him as part of the network. For a terrifying moment, there was no response, and Bartali wondered if the family had already been discovered and taken. But then he heard movement below, the scrape of wood against stone, and a section of debris shifted to reveal a narrow opening. A man's face appeared in the darkness, gaunt and terrified, eyes wide with the desperate hope that this stranger in the night had come to save them. Bartali descended into the basement and found himself in a nightmare of human suffering. 7 people, a husband and wife, their 3 children and the wife's elderly parents, had been living in this hole for nearly 2 weeks. They had no running water, no proper food, and no light except for a single candle they rationed carefully. The smell was overwhelming, a mixture of human waste, fear, and desperation. The children, 2 boys and a girl ranging from 5 to 11 years old, stared at Bartali with hollow eyes, their faces so thin that their cheekbones stood out sharply. The elderly grandfather could barely stand, his body weakened by malnutrition and the cold dampness of the basement. Bartali's heart broke at the sight, but he forced himself to focus on the mission. He pulled the 7 sets of documents from his coat lining and explained quickly what needed to happen. They would leave the basement in 2 groups, hours apart, to avoid drawing attention. The first group would be the parents and the 3 children, traveling as a Catholic family fleeing the bombing. The second group would be the grandparents, posing as elderly refugees seeking shelter in a church outside the city. The father, a man named Davide who had once been a respected jeweler in Florence, took Bartali's hands and began to weep. He tried to thank him, tried to find words adequate to express what this moment meant, but Bartali stopped him gently. He told him there was no time for gratitude, that every minute they remained in the basement increased the risk for everyone. He helped them memorize their new names, coached them on the details of their false identities, and made them repeat the information until he was confident they could answer questions without hesitation. The children were the biggest concern. Under interrogation or even casual questioning, a child might forget their new name or accidentally reveal details about their real past. Bartali knelt before each child and explained in the simplest terms he could manage that they were playing a game where they had to pretend to be someone else, and if they played the game perfectly, they would be safe. As dawn approached and the first group prepared to leave, Bartali faced an agonizing decision. The original plan had been to guide them to a safe house on the outskirts of Florence, where they could wait for transportation south toward Allied lines. But the safe house had been compromised 3 days earlier, information Bartali had only learned the night before. He had no backup location prepared, no alternative shelter arranged. He would have to improvise, something the network strictly forbade because improvisation meant unpredictability, and unpredictability meant death. But there was no choice. He could not send the family back into the basement to wait for a solution that might never come. So he made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He would take them to his own home, hide them there temporarily, and use his remaining contacts to find them safe passage out of Florence. It was insanely risky. It violated every security protocol the network had established, and if the Gestapo came for him, they would find not just him, but an entire Jewish family hiding under his roof. Bartali led the first group out of the basement, just as the sun began to rise. Timing their exit for the brief window, when patrols changed shifts and the streets were momentarily less monitored. They moved through the destroyed city like refugees among thousands of other refugees, just another family displaced by the bombing, clutching their few possessions and moving toward safety. Bartali walked ahead of them, maintaining a distance so they would not appear connected, but close enough to intervene if they were stopped. His eyes scanned every street corner, every doorway, every shadow where a German soldier might be watching. They passed a patrol once, a group of 4 Wehrmacht soldiers who glanced at the family but did not stop them. The children played their roles perfectly, staying silent, their eyes downcast, their new identities held together by fear and hope. And somehow, impossibly, they made it through the checkpoints, through the patrols, through the ruins of Florence, until they reached Bartali's neighborhood and slipped through his door just as the city began to wake, and the full danger of what he had done began to settle over him like a suffocating weight. For 3 days, Gino Bartali hid 7 Jewish refugees in his own home, while German soldiers patrolled the streets outside and the Gestapo conducted house-to-house searches looking for resistance members. His wife, who had been kept in the dark about his activities for months, finally learned the truth when she woke to find strangers living in their basement. The shock on her face transformed into understanding, then fear, then a fierce determination that matched her husband's own. She never questioned the decision. She simply began helping, cooking what little food they had, caring for the children, comforting the grandmother who wept silently in the corner. The entire family was now complicit in the most dangerous act of resistance imaginable, and there was no turning back. If the Gestapo came, they would all face execution together. Bartali spent those 3 days frantically working his remaining contacts, trying to arrange transportation for the family to Allied-controlled territory in the south. But the network was in shambles. Communication was nearly impossible, and every hour that passed increased the likelihood of discovery. On the 2nd day, German soldiers came to his street going door to door, demanding to search homes for hidden weapons and resistance activity. Bartali watched through his window as they moved methodically from house to house, and he knew that within the hour they would reach his door. He gathered the family in the basement and explained what was about to happen. They would hide in a false wall he had hastily constructed from old furniture and tarps, a hiding place so crude and obvious that it would never survive a thorough search. But it was all he had. The soldiers would come, they would look around, and if luck held one more time, they would leave without finding anything. The knock came exactly when Bartali expected it. 3 German soldiers stood at his door, led by a young officer who spoke broken Italian and carried a clipboard with a list of addresses. Bartali let them in, maintaining the calm demeanor that had saved him so many times before. The officer asked routine questions. How many people lived here? Were there any weapons in the house? Had he seen or heard anything suspicious? Bartali answered each question smoothly, and then did something that either brilliant or insane. He invited the officer to look at his collection of cycling trophies, the medals and awards from his victories across Europe. He played the role of the proud champion, the aging athlete reliving past glories, and the officer, clearly a sports enthusiast himself, became distracted by the memorabilia. They spent 10 minutes discussing the Tour de France, the officer asking questions about famous races, while his 2 subordinates conducted a cursory inspection of the house. They looked in the main rooms, glanced into the kitchen, but when they reached the basement stairs, the officer called them back, saying they had already spent too much time here and needed to finish the street before nightfall. As the soldiers left, Bartali stood at his door and watched them move to the next house, his legs trembling so badly he had to grip the doorframe to remain standing. His wife came up from the basement, her face pale, and simply held him without speaking. They both knew that this could not continue. The family could not stay hidden in their basement indefinitely, and the next search might be more thorough. Bartali needed a solution, and he needed it immediately. That night, he made contact with a priest who still had connections to a smuggling route through the Apennine Mountains, a treacherous path that crossed into Allied territory, but required days of hiking through terrain controlled by both German and fascist forces. It was dangerous, especially with children and elderly people, but it was the only option left. 2 nights later, Bartali led the family out of Florence under cover of darkness, guiding them to a meeting point where the priest and 2 resistance fighters were waiting with supplies for the mountain crossing. He said goodbye to the father, to the mother, to the children who had learned their false names so well, and he watched them disappear into the night, heading toward the mountains and freedom. He never saw them again. He never learned whether they made it across or were caught in the attempt. The uncertainty would torture him for years, but in that moment, standing alone on a dark road outside Florence, he knew that he had done everything humanly possible to save them, and that, his faith told him, would have to be enough. Florence was liberated by Allied forces on August 11, 1944, and when British and American soldiers marched through the streets, the city erupted in celebration. People poured out of hiding, waving flags, embracing the liberators, weeping with relief that the nightmare was finally over. But for Bartali, liberation brought not celebration, but a crushing exhaustion that had been building for nearly 2 years. He had spent months living on the edge of death, carrying secrets that could have destroyed dozens of lives, riding hundreds of kilometers each week through occupied territory, and risking everything for people he would never see again. Now that it was over, the adrenaline that had sustained him evaporated, and he collapsed into a depression that left him unable to ride his bicycle for weeks. His body, pushed beyond its limits by the constant physical demands of his courier missions, began to fail him. He developed chronic pain in his knees and back, injuries that would plague him for the rest of his cycling career. But the liberation of Florence did not mean the end of the war in Italy, and it certainly did not mean the end of Bartali's involvement with the resistance network. As Allied forces pushed north toward Germany, they discovered the full scope of Nazi atrocities in Italy. The transit camps where Jews had been held before deportation, the mass graves of executed partisans, the villages burned in retaliation for resistance activity. The Catholic network that had employed Bartali began compiling documentation of their rescue efforts, creating records that would prove how many lives had been saved and which members of the network had participated. Bartali was asked to provide testimony about his activities to help establish the number of people he had helped rescue. He refused. He told the network leaders that he had made a promise at the beginning. His actions would remain secret, his role would never be acknowledged, and he would not use his heroism for recognition or glory. This decision to remain silent became a defining principle of Bartali's post-war life. When journalists asked him about his activities during the occupation, he deflected the questions and talked about cycling. When historians researching the Italian resistance sought him out, he politely declined to be interviewed. When the Israeli government decades later began researching cases for the righteous among the nations, honor given to non-Jews who saved Jewish lives during the Holocaust, Bartali's name came up repeatedly in survivor testimonies, but he refused to provide the documentation needed to confirm his role. His family asked him why he would not accept recognition for something so heroic, something that could inspire others and preserve an important piece of history. His answer was always the same: good deeds should be done in silence, acts of mercy should not become acts of vanity. And the moment he started talking about what he had done, it would cease to be about the people he saved and become about him. The network estimated, based on fragmentary records and survivor accounts, that Bartali had transported documents for approximately 800 Jewish refugees during his time as a courier, though the real number might have been higher because many of the records were destroyed or lost during the chaos of liberation. 800 lives, 800 people who received forged identity papers that allowed them to escape deportation, to disappear into new identities, to survive when survival seemed impossible. But Bartali never confirmed the number, never discussed individual cases, never provided the details that would have made him a celebrated war hero. Instead, he returned to cycling, resuming his professional career as if the previous 2 years had been nothing more than an unfortunate interruption caused by the war. In 1948, at the age of 34, and after a decade since his last major victory, Bartali did the impossible. He won the Tour de France for a second time, becoming one of the oldest champions in the race's history. Italy, still recovering from the devastation of the war and teetering on the edge of civil unrest between communist and Christian Democrat factions, erupted in celebration at his victory. The win was seen as a unifying moment for a fractured nation, proof that Italian greatness could be restored. Bartali stood on the podium in Paris, accepting the yellow jersey and the adoration of millions, and he never once mentioned that the greatest victory of his life had nothing to do with cycling, that the real race he had won was measured not in kilometers, but in lives saved, not in trophies, but in families reunited, not in glory, but in silence. Gino Bartali carried his secret to the grave. He died in May of 2000, at the age of 85, having lived a long life as a cycling legend, a devout Catholic, and a man known for his humility and quiet dignity. Even on his deathbed, surrounded by family, he refused to discuss his wartime activities in detail. His son Andrea would later recall asking his father directly about the rumors of rescue missions and document smuggling, and Bartali's response was always the same evasive deflection. Some medals are pinned to your soul, not your jacket, and you do not talk about them because talking diminishes their value. It was only after his death, when historians and Jewish organizations began piecing together survivor testimonies and fragmentary resistance records, that the full scope of what Bartali had done began to emerge from the shadows. The breakthrough came when a researcher at Yad Vashem, Israel's Holocaust memorial, discovered a cache of documents from the Catholic Rescue Network that had operated in Tuscany during the war. The documents included coded references to a cyclist courier, mentions of someone identified only as Gino, and testimonies from survivors who described being saved by forged papers delivered by a famous athlete who rode a bicycle. Cross-referencing these accounts with Bartali's known movements during the occupation revealed an unmistakable pattern. He had been exactly where the document said the courier had been, at exactly the right times, covering distances that matched his capabilities as an elite cyclist. The evidence was overwhelming, but it was circumstantial, because Bartali himself had never confirmed anything, and the network's security protocols had ensured that few written records identified him directly. In 2013, 13 years after Bartali's death, Yad Vashem formally recognized him as righteous among the nations, the highest honor Israel bestows on non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. The ceremony was attended by his children and grandchildren, and by survivors who testified that they owed their lives to documents Bartali had delivered. The Israeli ambassador to Italy called him a hero who embodied the best of humanity, a man who chose conscience over safety and mercy over fear. But even in death, Bartali's wish for silence was partially respected. Many details of his missions remained classified or unknown. Many of the families he saved were never identified, and the exact number of lives he touched will never be known with certainty. The network's secrecy, which had protected everyone during the war, now made it impossible to fully document the scope of his heroism. The story of Gino Bartali forces us to confront an uncomfortable question. How many other heroes existed whose stories were never told? How many ordinary people in occupied Europe and beyond performed acts of extraordinary courage that were never documented, never celebrated, never remembered? Bartali was only discovered because he was famous enough that his name appeared in fragmentary records, because survivors remembered that their rescuer had been a cycling champion. But what about the unknown farmers who hid families in their barns, the anonymous forgers who created the documents, the countless individuals who risked everything and then disappeared back into normal life without ever seeking recognition? History tends to remember the loud heroes, the ones who demanded attention or whose deeds were too spectacular to ignore. But the quiet heroes, the ones who acted out of conscience rather than glory, often vanish without a trace. Bartali understood something profound about heroism that most people miss. True moral courage does not seek an audience. He could have parlayed his wartime activities into fame, wealth, and political influence in post-war Italy. He could have written books, given speeches, accepted honors, and been celebrated as a national treasure. Instead, he chose silence, because he understood that the moment his actions became about him, they would cease to be about the people he saved. His faith taught him that goodness done in secret is the purest form of righteousness, and he lived that principle until his final breath. The world eventually discovered what he did, but only because others spoke for him after he was gone. And perhaps that is the most important lesson of Gino Bartali's life. The greatest heroes are often the ones we never hear about, the ones who pedal through darkness, carrying other people's lives in the frames of their bicycles, who risk everything for strangers, and who return home to silence, because that is where true virtue lives. The war produced countless acts of evil that were documented, photographed, and remembered. But it also produced countless acts of grace that disappeared into obscurity, known only to God and the people who were saved. Gino Bartali was one of those acts of grace, a champion who won a race that history almost forgot, and whose greatest victory was measured not in seconds, but in souls.